Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here, and today we find ourselves in the Signum world with armies of fantastic creatures and glorified heroes at the forefront. You'll take part in an epic showdown in the battlefield and unleash a real war out there. Fantasy Commander is a strategy board game with highly detailed 20mm miniatures. It's for 1 to 4 players, takes 60 to 90 minutes to play, is for ages 12 and up, and published by Signum Games. Now it's on Kickstarter right now, so I'm going to show you how the game works, and I'll see you on the other side. This is a Kickstarter preview, so all the art and components you see here are not final, they're prototypes. To see all the most up-to-date art and components, check the Kickstarter link in the description of this video. Now there are multiple different game modes in Fantasy Commander. You could play a scenario mode, and this is one of the ways that you'll be playing against another player. And you'll be going through different scenarios like this one, Chapter 1, the first encounter, the first scenario, for example. It shows you how to set the map, all terrain, and things like that. And you'll be either constructing your own armies, or you'll be able to use predetermined and pre-set up armies. There's also a Battle Royal mode where you have the maximum freedom in building your own army and generating the game map. But today we're going to focus on the campaign mode. Now this has many different missions, and today we're going to be focusing on this first mission called the Night Queen. And the goal of this mission is to kill the vampires you see in the upper left, and we're going to be fighting against the vampire itself and its zombie archers. Now, most of the game core concepts are the same between this and the scenario version, so you'll still get a feel for how the game works. It's just some of the enemies act differently, and there's some small little differences in mechanics that I'll go over as well. So I have that mission set up here that we'll walk through a little bit of the game. Now there actually are more enemy units on the board at the beginning of this mission, but I'm sort of streamlining this just to show you the very basics of how the game works. Now each mission is different, but we start with 3 units of Legionnaires conscript like this. It shows you what they look like. It shows you different things about them, like how big the unit is. It actually has 4 soldiers. The attack, the defense, the moving, the stamina. Now this can be represented by a token like this, which represents all 4 soldiers of this unit. And when you move, you'll be moving this around. Or instead of the token, if you have the miniatures, you'd be using those as your soldiers instead of just the token. So here I'm actually using one as the token, and the other 2 I'm using with miniatures, just to show you the differences between them. This one's a little easier to teach because you can see the numbers, but this is actually easy to teach as well, because as you lose health, you actually just lose one of your soldiers, for example. Now each round of the game will go through a command phase and an action phase. During the command phase, you're going to see what orders, you're going to generate these orders. Now, I have 3 of these conscripts, and here it will show me for each of this, I'll roll a die. Depending on the color, will tell me what color order I get. Where, in other games, when you have other armies, it might tell you exactly which orders to get, for example. Red's the best, it's going to be trigger first, and then the purple ones are wild, if you will. But this game, I just have these, so we would roll 3 dice and see which orders we got. Let's say we rolled this and this is what we have. We would get 1 red order and we would get 2 blue orders because we essentially have 3 of these, so we would roll 3 dice to see what we get. Now, in the normal scenario-based when you're playing against another player, you would be placing these secretly on the different units, so they don't know which orders are going where. They'll know which ones you've gotten, but they won't know which one you placed where. Oh, and by the way, with those dice rolls, you can actually re-roll the dice, but for each time you re-roll, you actually roll 1 less die to try to get an order that you really want. But in this campaign version, you're playing against the game, so you'll just place them face up and showing which orders are going where. Now in the campaign, it will tell you specifically which numbered orders to use, and in this case we have all these different ones that they possibly would be using. And those tokens are randomly assigned to the different units that you're playing against. And again, at this point you're going to take turns depending on the order. Remember, reds go first, then blues, then greens, and then finally the blank yellow ones. Now even before you choose a unit to activate, you'll flip a card over from an event deck, and this is specifically built depending on the mission that you're going to. But for now, we'll skip this for right now, but we'll come back to what these events do later. Now we have 2 reds and a blue, and they have a blue and a green. So they don't have any reds, so we are actually going to activate both of these units before we go to the next ones, which are blue. And if it's tied, like 2 of us have blue, well then we have the initiative, we get to go before them. So it's basically going to go these 2 units, then this unit, then the vampire, and then them. Now, one of the things you can do with your order token when it's your turn is to move, and this shows you how much you can move. By default, you'll move 1. And simply, you can move in any hex that's not past impassable terrain, not through other units, and so you could easily just move this thing like this. Now your movement would also end if you got into a zone of control, which are all the hexes that are sort of surrounding an enemy unit like that. Movement would end right there if that's where we were. Now when moving, again, this is essentially 4 units, which is the same thing as maybe moving these 4, but you'd always move each unit together. So these 4 miniatures are always going to sort of move together. So are these, and so are the other ones. But between them, they're separate units. So you're going to be doing different things with different ones. Now, if we were here at the beginning of our movement, we could move 1, but after you move, again, we're in that zone of control now, our movement would stop anyways, but after you move as normal, you could attack in melee, and that's if you are, right next to someone like that. Now, instead of that, you could run, which is the second number here, up to 2. So we could go, 1, 2, we're moving a little bit faster, but you cannot melee attack after you run, unless you want to spend a fatigue token. Now let me show you how this works. Let's say we started here, we wanted to run, 1, 2. Normally you can't attack when doing that, but if we did, we could do so, but we'd have to take a fatigue. And this gets placed on here, and this shows you that we have 1 fatigue, and we have 2 of stamina. Once our fatigue matches our stamina, you wouldn't be able to use any more fatigue until you rest. And to rest, essentially, instead of taking a normal type of order, you would take a blank order, which is sort of yellow. And on its turn, all it's going to do is spend this order to rest and take the fatigue tokens off. Now, in addition to doing a melee attack after running to take a fatigue token, there's other different ways, like you can add dice to the attack roll, you can add dice to the defense roll, you can cancel damage. Different things will allow you to exert extra energy and get fatigue. But again, if you get equal to your stamina, you're exhausted. Now, speaking of running and going through impassable terrain, these are rocks, and those are essentially impassable, and they actually block line of sight, meaning if I had a weapon that I could shoot with, I can't even shoot the vampire right now because they're behind. Think of big sort of mountainous rocks there. I wouldn't be able to shoot them. You'd have to go around the graveyards and come in that way, or come through the graveyards. Now this unit is going to use an amount of dice by default by its attacking power, which are 3, but the number of dice could change depending on event cards, terrains, and activated abilities and things like that. So let's say we rolled the 3 dice. Now remember, you could add a die to the attack roll if you want to add some fatigue there. And in this case, we didn't. So there's different things that could happen. This is typically when you're defending, so that doesn't do me a whole lot of good. This is going to attack and hit them as long as they're not weak, and weak is if they only had 1 soldier left. So they got more than 1, so this would have hit. And this just hits even if they did have 1 or more. So we have 2 hits here. Now typically they can defend if they want to get rid of one of their unused order tokens if they wanted to. And when they would, then they would roll 1 die, for example, for that. And they could possibly defend. In this case, it would be defending 1 of those attacks. And this would also block 1 of those attacks. Now, if they roll this and they have support, meaning they have a unit that's next to them, this now would help them defend. But if they rolled something like this, it wouldn't help them at all. Now, if the attacker had one of their own units that were next to them and here, then if they rolled this, then that would actually count as an attack, for example. And for every loss, they would essentially lose. So let's say they lost 2, they would lose 2 of those like that. Now let's say this was rolled, they weren't able to defend, they lost 2 of their people, and we rolled this as well. That's panicked. And if they weren't able to block the panic, then they must actually retreat in the opposite direction of the attacker, and they're going to be moving as far as they run for each of the panics there. Now remember, normally before you activate a unit, you're going to take a card from the event deck that's specific for this mission, and then activate this, and then choose your unit. So let's get back to what these do. These things do all sorts of different things. Like Famine, your activated unit gains a fatigue token. If the unit has maximum fatigue tokens, it takes 1 damage, so that would be pretty bad. But there's other cards in there like Farm, and if you get this, then you get to remove a Famine card from the discard pile and generate a green order. It's a great way to have some extra orders to do things like defending and using extra orders in ways that I've showed you before. Or maybe Exhaustion comes up and your activated unit cannot use Run and receives a fatigue token, and if it can't receive it, it ends the activation instead. Really terrible things. So all sorts of different things come through these event decks. So again, you'd activate the orders in the order of the colors and such, as I mentioned earlier. And now let's talk a little bit just about this specific mission. Now we'll look here, we see the vampire and the zombie archers. Now the vampire, it has armor, you can see that at the top. It ignores one attack of the enemy attacks. And if it's not in its initial spot, it moves to it at the start of its turn. Also at the bottom right, it says the vampire has support from unoccupied graveyards, and together they constitute formation. So remember, it will come back here at the start of its turn if it's not there, and that's important because these two things are graveyards there. And so as long as these are unoccupied, it's getting support from those, which is why, these are impassable terrain, you want to go around here. But if you're sort of cutting around and going closer, then if you're there, then you're actually occupying those, and they won't have support, so you kind of want to go through the graveyards and to go attack her. And that formation that it gives her helps her avoid panics easier. Now also on the vampire, you can see left to right, just under the token there. She has, attack, she rolls 3 dice, she has 1 for the defense, 2 stamina, she has 1 health, and she has the move of 1 and the run of 2. But below that, you see the abilities. And in this case, you would look at the number of the order she has. In this case, it was a 3 blue that was randomly given to her. And we look at just below that. So she has an ability that says attack. All units on the graveyards receive 1 fatigue token. And that's crazy because we want to be in the graveyards because it stops her formation. It's the best way to attack her from. But we might possibly be getting hit there with fatigue tokens if she has that specific order, but you know what that is going into that round, so it helps with the strategy of what you're trying to do. Now let's look at the zombie archers. They have an ability called Resurgent, and that means if they're under attack and the attacker rolls a panic, it deals damage instead of panic. In other words, they're really hard to sort of move back, but they have 1 attack, 1 defense. Now the next one over from that defender to the right is the ranged attack, if you will, because they have the arrows there. They're going to be doing ranged attacks. Now you can't do a ranged attack if you're in the enemy's zone of control, meaning you're somewhere around an enemy, or if you've already moved in the current activation. Plus, in order to do the ranged attack, you need line of sight. So if we were here and they were there, you can draw from the middle to here to the middle to there, and they have line of sight. But you can't go, you can't go through impassable terrains, and it can't go through other units and things like that. Now you see that their range for their shooting is 2 to 4. That means they can shoot 2 and hexes away, which we are now, with no penalty. But if you shoot towards the maximum of that, you get -1 attack die for that. Now, as you can see, they only have an attack of 1, showing the sword value there. But some of their extra abilities below, depending on what order token they were given randomly, like the second one down there, if you had a 3 or 4 there, they get to gain a distance of attack, for example. And the one just below that, number 5, they gain +1 attack die and +1 to the attack. So, there's different things that will allow them to shoot at different ranges depending on that. And right now, they actually have a 6, which is attack. They could ignore line of sight, for example. And going through the battle is very similar to what I had already showed you. Now, if you're using tokens like this, for every time you get hit, you would lose a health. This has a 4 size, basically 4 soldiers. As soon as it loses 4, it's destroyed. And if you're playing with the miniatures, you simply remove 1 miniature for every time that they take damage. Again, the goal in this specific mission is to kill the vampire. Now, if you do kill the vampire, as you can see, you'll get certain rewards. Now, if you do it between turns 3 and 7, you get the reward. If you do the turns 8 and above, you get your reward, but you also draw an escalation card, which has some negative effects for you. Then at the bottom right, you get to choose. Do you agree to accept the ransom and release the vampire? You choose number 1 on page 16, you read that. Otherwise, choice 2, you execute the vampire and you read choice number 2 on page 16, and they'll have different consequences. There's also a sheet that will help you follow through with all of your completed missions and keep the amount of golds and the different escalation cards and buildings and armies and all sorts of different things that you can track. Now, those are just the very basics of the game. I've already talked about the 3 main ways of playing it, but with all the different missions, and I've just showed you just the very basics of characters and movement and attacking things. Like, look at this. Here's Legionnaires. Here's Conscript, which is what we were using. Here's another version of it, a Veteran, and even a better version of it, the Champion. Now, by default, this one has Defender, which means that if they're next to an enemy and you're being attacked, another one of your units is being attacked, but one of these defenders is next to it, you could say, you know what, you're not attacking that other unit, you're attacking me. This one has that, but also has Master Defense, which means when the unit defends against melee or ranged attacks, it can re-roll 2 dice like that. Now this one has that, plus it has Agile, which means it essentially ignores an enemy's zones of control when moving through. So different versions of characters as well. Now here's a bunch of other leaders of units, and if you'd like to see all the abilities and see what they do here, just pause the video and look at these in detail. Now here's some more, with the first two being the normal cards that you would use for the ones that I had actually showed in this mission, but when you're playing a scenario based against another opponent, because the abilities change and the way they work are different than in the campaign. Like for example, this one would give a purple and a blue order. This one would give, well, you roll to find out, and the purple ones are wild. So pretty powerful, but you can see some of the other ones here, and for each of these, some of them are conscripts, some of them are veterans, some of them are champions. You can sort of upgrade some of these and get different versions of them, but feel free to pause and see what some of these different ones do. Now here are some close-ups of some of the miniatures in the game. Some of these are the smaller standard ones, and some of these are the larger ones, and there's many more. I'm not even showing you all of them, so check the Kickstarter link to see the rest of them. Now in a nutshell, that's a very broad base of how the game works, the different methods of playing. There's so many things I haven't shown you, like even quest cards that you'll be using in the scenario base when you're playing against an opponent, where you'll be doing different things to get different points, like be the first to deal damage to an enemy, certain things like that. So there's so much here. I encourage you to check the Kickstarter link to see the breadth that this game has to offer. Well, there you have Fantasy Commander, and as I showed in the overview, although the game is basically designed as a two-player duel game, you can involve even more players in additional game modes, as well as test yourself in a single-player narrative campaign where you can easily master basic game rules. Now, if you'd like to see all the up-to-date art and components and the different pledge levels available, you can click the link below me right in the description of this video. Now, that's going to take you right to the Kickstarter project page, and I'm sure that Signum Games would love your support.